To get us started, I probably don't need to tell you how wonderful 2022 was for the markets. Did everybody enjoy this last year? I see the smile on the face over there. So especially in the world of digital assets, we're all looking for clarity and for where we go from here. That's why I couldn't think of a better way to commence our track by looking into the developments in the regulatory framework. And I'm particularly pleased to welcome to this stage the Commissioner of the Commodities Future and Trading Commission, Summer Mersinger, and a conversation with a friend of mine, Jeff Banman, who's the COO and General Counsel of 6529 Capital. Let's welcome them to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the digital assets track. We're going to kick off the day by talking about regulation and the regulatory landscape and what the year ahead looks like. I am joined by Commissioner Summer Mersinger of the CFTC. She has a very impressive background. In addition to working as a CFTC commissioner, she was previously in the staff of another commissioner's office. She worked on the Hill for Senator Thune, among others, has a great and wide-ranging background. So, Summer, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great. And I'm Jeff Banman, founder and principal of Banman Advisors, which focuses on RegTech and strategic innovation. I'm also the COO for 6529 Capital, 6529 Museum, and 6529 Holdings, which is very active in the NFT space, in advocating for an open metaverse and investing in a fund which focuses primarily and directly in investable NFTs. So let's jump into the discussion. First, regulation is constantly on a lot of people's mind. The CFTC is one of the agencies that's in the news. People often don't understand what the role of a particular agency is, or then what its relationship is to the world of digital assets. So let's, just to level set here, what is the role of the CFTC when it comes to digital assets?
That's a great place to start. And before I get going, I do have to give a disclaimer as a government employee that the views I express today are my own, and they do not reflect the views of my fellow commissioners or of the commission. So with that out of the way, so right now the CFTC has somewhat of a limited role in regulating this space, in regulating digital assets. We have enforcement authority when there's been fraud and manipulation. And this dates back to Dodd-Frank and the idea that if there's fraud and manipulation in a cash market, that can affect the futures market price discovery function. So we can go in, and our enforcement team can do an investigation. They can issue subpoenas, talk to people, and file a case based on that fraud and manipulation authority. The problem is that's after the fact. That's after the money's gone. That's after people have lost their funds. So it really is an after the fact authority that we have. We do not have any visual into cash, crypto, or digital asset spot markets or cash markets. We don't examine them. They're not subject to a lot of our regulatory requirements, such as customer segregations, adequate capital. There's just a number of regulations that we have for our registered entities that spot cash markets for crypto and digital assets are not subject to. So we really are just after the fact, after fraud and manipulation has occurred and we can prove it, that's when our jurisdiction comes in right now.
Yeah, and it's very important. It's subtle but very important and consequential distinction. It has to do with the authority that the agency had, which is ultimately the decision of and conferred by Congress. And in fact, there's been. We'll talk about the collapse of FTX in just a moment. But there's been criticism, which I think, if you're close to it, you think is unfair, that the CFTC did not have the supervisory authority. And in fact, I recall in about 2016, 2017, when I was doing some of the outreach for what became Lab CFTC, I met with a number of spot crypto exchanges in New York, and we were chatting for a while, and after a while they said, Jeff, you seem like a reasonable guy. The CFTC seems like a sophisticated agency. Would you guys be interested in regulating us? And I had to explain, thanks so much, but it's not like the CFTC can just sit there and whenever they see a market that it believes would benefit from its supervision, it can just decide to go regulate it. That goes back to the types of authority that we were discussing. So, you've given kind of the bigger picture of the CFTC's enforcement as opposed to supervisory authority. The collapse of FTX, obviously one of the most enormous and, obviously far-reaching, has harmed many people. Appears that there was extensive fraud, theft, manipulation of things. So what was the CFTC actually in a position to do with regards to FTX, during the time it was operating? And, what does this imply in your view for the powers and authority that the CFTC perhaps needs to have?
No, and I do think the FTX collapse has been a bit of a case study for, where there are gaps in the jurisdiction. I always start by saying when I talk about this, it is really unfortunate because people lost money. There are people who can't access their money, and customers were harmed, and that is really unfortunate. And all of the government entities now that are bringing charges, again, it's all after the fact. People can't get their money. People lost their money. So what that shows is there's this kind of gap in, okay, who's looking over these cash markets when people start to invest. Our role, and the reason we were involved, is at some point FTX bought a registered entity at the CFTC. It's a designated, it's a clearinghouse, an exchange that was able to do fully collateralized futures trading on crypto. And that license had already been in place. That entity was already under our oversight. So we've been examining LedgerX. We've been supervising them for some time. What happened was FTX asked permission or applied to change their kind of designation to allow them to do margined futures on crypto. So the idea that now they would be taking in margin and people would be highly leveraged in this market where now they're fully collateralized. And it was unique because normally that goes through a very specific process of having intermediaries collecting margin along the way, having the exchange become the counterparty, and really a lot of checks and balances in that system to make sure that the money is where it's supposed to be, the amount of money is there, and that really one collapse of one entity doesn't take down the whole system. The idea here was that they could provide a direct model where retail customers could go straight to the exchange, trade on leverage, and the margin and kind of the risk would be managed through an automated liquidation system, which we've heard a lot about since the collapse of FTX. So we were in the process of looking through that application, seeing how our rules would be, how you could adapt our rules to maybe allow this. And we spent a lot of time, talking to them, understanding their process. But it was really hard to fit that into our regulations. And we ended up not actually having a vote. When FTX collapsed, LedgerX actually withdrew their application. But what's been interesting about that is one, LedgerX isn't part of the bankruptcy proceedings. They are well capitalized, the money is there, the customer funds are segregated as they should be. They've got plenty of operating capital. So the regulations we applied to that specific entity actually made it, kind of foolproof. Now, whether or not, money was moved around, we don't know that yet, but we do know as of today, the money we expect to be in LedgerX is there. And it's kind of the bright spot in all of this to show that, regulations can work, and these types of requirements serve a purpose. And I think that was kind of eye-opening for a lot of policymakers that, hey, if similar kind of registration and oversight was available, and you forced, you had customer segregation and you had forced the company to have operating capital, in a specific count that regulators could see, that probably, we can't say if that would have stopped fraud, but we do feel comfortable that maybe there would have been a few more checks and balances in the system. So that's our role right now. We're still working closely with LedgerX. They're still a registered entity. Somebody will purchase them, and we'll continue to work with them as a registrant at the agency. But that was really how we were involved with FTX, and that's kind of where we stand now as part of this. Now, there's been some discussion around the sale of LedgerX in bankruptcy proceedings and whether or not the CFTC has any ability to maybe, try to encourage or even, suggest the type of buyer for LedgerX. We don't have that authority. That is up to the bankruptcy court. They will do what's best. It will go to the best bid, and whether or not that buyer is who we would ideally have, it doesn't matter because we'll continue to regulate that entity the way we do. So they'll still have to abide by our core principles. They'll still have to be subject to our examinations, and that really gives us some protection to make sure that whoever's registered with us will follow our rules, or they'll be subject to our enforcement.
Yeah, so that illustrates, I think, a number of important points. The entity, LedgerX, which became known as FTX Derivatives, fully licensed, supervised, and examined by the CFTC, had a trading platform for futures, for swaps, for options. It has a designated clearing organization, which is a clearinghouse, which is really where the customer funds are safeguarded. The CFTC supervisory and licensing regime provides for separation and segregation of those. So, if a market like the broader FTX that, millions of people used and more people were familiar with were under a similar regime, then it could have had those safeguards. And, in fact, in connection with the margin proposal that FTX Derivatives had been proposing and discussing, they had moved $250 million in that was going to be the backstop for their margin calculator to figure out when to liquidate people. This, I think, was the same calculator that they supposedly or allegedly exempted Alameda from in the other FTX. But the point is, those funds were still there, that the users of this exchange were protected. So, it's very, very consequential whether a marketplace is actually licensed and supervised by the regulator and has a comprehensive framework like that. And, people do ask the question, well, why isn't there already a federal regulator of the spot market for crypto assets? And in fact, it'd be very, very, in today's economy and regulatory system, there's actually no case, with one exception, where there's a federal regulator that directly supervises the trading of a commodity. And that has to do with electricity that's regulated under FERC, right? So as we were discussing, cows and, livestock, other, traditional, products or not, which doesn't mean that it shouldn't happen. It just means that it actually would be a significant change. But this is clearly, one of the things that's being accelerated the policy discussion that was happening a lot last year. Perhaps if FTX had not collapsed, some legislation would have happened. But you're in the trenches. You see what's happening on the commission side. You've worked on the Hill. How do you think this affects the landscape of what might happen and the dynamics of whether something can happen in terms of legislation in this Congress?
Yeah, it was definitely an interesting time for the FTX collapse, because there was a path in Congress to get some sort of legislation in place that at least allowed the CFTC to have a registration process for cash crypto commodities. But unfortunately, with the collapse, it brought a lot of that legislation into question. There was questions about how much FTX was involved in preparing that legislation, and it really just put the brakes on that process. But I think everyone that's involved in these talks on Capitol Hill understand that they can't just walk away from this either, because this, FTX was the first collapse, and obviously there were collapses before that, but the risks are pretty obvious, and so they realize something has to be done. I think we've had a good run with the states really doing what they could through their money transmitter license, or where some states actually have a regime for registration, but having some sort of federal oversight is important for a number of reasons. One of them is because we also look at systemic risk. We can see across the financial system where there's systemic risk, and so it's important to really have some federal oversight here. There have been a few changes in Congress politically. The House changed from a Democrat to a Republican. Our Oversight Committee is the House and Senate Agriculture Committee, which probably seems very odd to most people, but our agency did start at the Department of Agriculture, because the first futures products are really on grains and livestock. So those committees, the makeup hasn't changed that much. On the House side, the new Chairman G.T. Thompson, he's actually been a leader in crypto. He's had a bill out there, so I think he's going to really try to, work to get something done. The Senate didn't change much. Senate Agriculture Committee is pretty committed to getting something done. It is a little bit tricky, because I think before, where maybe the Senate and House Ag committees were able to move forward and kind of keep it within their jurisdiction, I don't think that's going to happen anymore. They're going to have to work closely with the Senate Banking Committee. They're going to have to work closely with the House Financial Services Committee. The new chairman in House Financial Services, Patrick McHenry, is very involved in crypto, very interested. He's going to want part of this legislation. So I think, they have a place to start. Now they're going to have to work with these other committees, but I actually think that'll bring about a better legislative framework when you have more of the committees involved and working together. I think if they can get to an agreement, if the two committees on either side can get to a place where everyone's comfortable, I think this has a pretty good fast track to being headed to the White House. So, but after so many years on the Hill, I can tell you, you cannot predict what's going to happen. Yeah. Sure things are never a sure thing. And it's one of those where, sometimes the stars have to align just right to get anything done. But it usually also takes a crisis to get Congress to act, and I think that we've seen that. So I do think there's definitely interest to move something in this next Congress.
Yeah, I mean, those are so many interesting dynamics, and you've alluded to the agricultural side, which is kind of the silo, if you will, of committee of jurisdiction that the CFTC and the kind of commodity derivatives market open under. You've mentioned House Financial Services and Senate Banking. Those are committees of jurisdiction for the SEC, obviously for all the banking supervisors. So it sounds like there's potentially going to be kind of more seats, more committee chairs at the table. I mean, I think in the last Congress, the bills on spot commodities that got the most attention were the DCCPA, which was Chair Stabenow and Ranking Member Bozeman in the Senate, and then there was the Gillibrand-Lummis kind of omnibus bill. Yeah. Are there other pieces of legislation that people should be kind of tracking as well, or you think those we're going to start to hear more about to see if this all kind of coalesces?
So on the House side, the G.T. Thompson bill I mentioned, it's the DCEA, the Digital Commodity Exchange Act. It's been out there for a while, but I think that we'll see more of that legislation kind of coming into the discussion, where the way things were going right before FTX collapse, a lot of this work could be done in the Senate and kind of push into a year-end spending bill. They don't have that luxury this time. They're going to have to work a little more closely with the House. And so I do think you'll see aspects of that House bill in play. McHenry, House Financial Services, very interested in stablecoins, definitely wants to, he's been working on legislation, and he's been working working very closely with his counterpart, Maxine Waters. So, they'll have it's kind of a strong piece on the stablecoin side. And it will be interesting to see, in the Senate Banking Committee, which Lummis serves on, and she's been a leader in this space, and I think she'll be more involved. But you also have the Senate Banking Committee Chairman, Sherrod Brown, who is not a fan at all of these assets, of these exchanges, and that makes this an even more difficult process. So I do think there's going to be other bills that we see involved here, and certainly with the additional players, it'll bring a little bit more into the bill. I'm hoping that it also gives us an opportunity to create a framework where we work with our federal regulator, our partners, and say, okay, if there's a digital asset, here's how we determine what it is. Is it a security? Is it a commodity? Is it something else? We can do joint rulemaking. We've done it before with the SEC. That's not new. Certainly, it's something we could do again. And I think that would actually really help bring some clarity to the space, to say to the CFTC and the SEC and others, create a framework so people have some clarity coming into this market when they bring new digital assets onto an exchange. What is it? And you're not going to have a regulator come in after the fact and say, we've decided that's a security and we're going to charge you with security frauds, or vice versa. So I do hope that we get that framework as part of whatever legislation comes out of Congress.
Yeah, that's a great thought to kind of wrap up that particular subject on. And so the fact is, even if Congress enacted legislation tomorrow, which obviously it's not going to do on this particular issue, it would still take some number of years for the regulatory framework, for the licensing and supervision to be in place, for the regulators to build up the expertise or further develop their expertise and have the resources in place. And after the 2008 crisis, the two agencies, but particularly the CFTC, got a lot of new responsibility for swaps, and over time it implemented regulations around and rulemakings around supervision of marketplaces, business conduct, but these things will take a number of years. So even if that happened, it's not going to be overnight. So I would say at least the one jurisdiction in the U.S. that provides real regulation of spot markets is New York for the time being. You sort of alluded to enforcement at the end of your last comments, and so no discussion of regulation and of digital assets would be complete without some discussion of enforcement. And it's funny, at dinner last night with one of the other conference attendees, we were talking about the CFTC and the SEC, and I was, kind of complimenting some of the balance that the CFTC has shown on, responsible innovation in the digital asset space. And the person said, well, wait, aren't they the ones who went after the Dow? And I was like, well, but Commissioner Mersinger is the one who wrote the dissent. So this involved a case called UkiDAO, which I think a lot of people had never heard of, but that had been operating what appeared from the complaints to be an unregistered derivatives market. But maybe kind of a two-part question here. First of all, what is the role of a commissioner when it comes to enforcement matters? And then what was it about that particular case that inspired you to write a dissent?
So we have an interesting role in our enforcement program in that any major action, any formal action taken by an enforcement division requires a vote by the commission. So everything from subpoenas all the way to settling the case, all of that is required to have a vote of the full commission. So we do have a lot of insight into our enforcement program along the way. We kind of see these cases develop from the subpoena, starting with the subpoenas to the very end. So we do have a pretty active role. But this case was interesting, and I do have to be careful because it's still an active case, and I'm very limited in what I can say about active litigation. But what I can talk about is, my dissent and why I ended up, writing and publishing it. I think when you looked at the case, they did settle a case with what's called B0X and the two founders of that, which was kind of the predecessor to UkiDAO. And then they charged UkiDAO with violating the Commodity Exchange Act. What concerned me about that was the way we were going about it, classifying the DAO as an association under state law, is that we were going to hold any token holder of the DAO, potentially liable for violating the CEA. Now, to take a step back, the DAO was violating the CEA very clearly. What was set up and what the DAO was doing was a clear violation of our act. But I was concerned with this idea that just by simply being part of the DAO, being a token holder, you would somehow become, be held accountable for the acts of the DAO. And to me, that will discourage anyone from, participating, from, maybe you don't like the fact that they're violating the law and you want to say something and be part of the governance team, and suddenly that could make you liable. And that was my big concern is, this is a public policy question that should be best decided by state legislatures, Congress, is being looked at globally for how do you legally define a DAO. And I felt we were taking a step forward in a direction where the enforcement action was trying to legally define who would be liable under our act for actions of the DAO. And I feel very strongly that our enforcement should stay within the bounds of our statute. And this, to me, didn't feel as though that's what we were doing. So I felt the need to speak out publicly and say, we are creating regulation through enforcement, and that's not the best way to go about that because you take the public aspect out of the process.
Thank you for making that dissent. And also, with that, we're out of time. Thank you so much, Commissioner Mersinger, for joining us today. It's great to hear.
Thanks for having me.